spend a lot of time with business students and business people the business students sometimes feel guilt about being business majors because they're just viewed as greedy business majors. And the business people often feel like they are second-class citizens in their churches because they don't have the higher calling of being a pastor or a missionary. One of the guys I've gotten to know recently, his company it's called Liquid Metal, and they make the silver part that goes around all of the iPhones. And this is a material that it's a new composite that is titanium in its strength, but is flexible like aluminum. And his company makes this product. And he's one of the few guys I know of that when his first company went public, he was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, above the fold. He's this incredibly successful businessman, and he made the most interesting comment to me. He said, I grew up in a family where my dad was a pastor, and because God didn't call me to be a pastor, I always felt like I got gypped. And he has always felt like he is doing something less than for God's kingdom because he's not a pastor or missionary. And my seminary students will tell me routinely, they'll say, I left my business to go serve the Lord full time. And I try to shoot back as quickly as I can, where did you learn such terrible theology? And they'll say, well, I'm so excited about coming to Talbot because I'm going into the ministry. And I said, in reality, you're doing no such thing. You are changing arenas of service. And when people tell me that they are stepping down from the pastorate and therefore leaving the ministry, I look at them in shock and say, you mean to tell me that you've defected from your faith? Because theologically, that's the only way you leave the ministry. I tell my students that you enter full-time ministry, which just means service. Diakonia just means service. At the moment you come to faith, and the only time you ever leave full-time service is if you defect from the faith. And your decision about where you're going to get a paycheck from has nothing to do with your decision to be in ministry or not. It's you're choosing the arena of service that you are going to serve in. And so what we tell business people is that business is your ministry. And that's grounded theologically in the fact that work was ordained prior to the entrance of sin, not after it, so that your work is not your penalty as a result of sin. And both the bookends of biblical history, in paradise in the creation and in paradise when the Lord returns, you will be working. Right? Now, I hate to break that to you, and I'm not sure about the getting a paycheck part when the kingdom comes, but the Scripture suggests that as a part of what it means to be made in God's image, we are hardwired for work, which I think is the reason that it's not unusual that people die sometimes very shortly after they, quote, retire. And as a result, there are no categories in the Scripture for retirement. This is really foundational to establishing this connection between faith, work, and economics. And this is why we say at Biola University, where I teach, that accounting is ministry, filmmaking is ministry, finance is ministry, marketing is ministry. And to make sure we get this right, we need to be clear that it's the very work itself that constitutes a significant part of the ministry. It's very interesting when we talk to people about their ministry in the workplace. They refer to things like, praying for coworkers or sharing their faith with them. All of those things that they're doing, ironically, when they are not doing their jobs. And actually, we tell them, putting yourself at risk of actually stealing time from your employer if you do too much of that. But it's the work itself that is their service to Christ. Paul makes this really clear in Colossians 3 when he addresses to slaves who did the most grunt, menial, mindless work available in the ancient world, said, in whatever you do to slaves, do it with all your heart, because in whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. So that if the grunt work of slaves is considered their service to Christ, how much more is what the business person does considered service to Christ? And I would argue that if what the business person does is God's work in the world, analogous to what the pastor does is God's work in the church, and what the missionary does is God's work on the mission field, then doing God's work in the world, I would suggest, has eternal significance. And that's ultimately what gives it its value. And so to affirm work as your calling is so important for the business person to hear. And they ought not feel like they are doing something less than for God's kingdom when they come to our churches.